The year was 1907, and the air inside Zollinger's department store in New Berlin, Ohio, smelled of dust and failure. The building sat in a small industrial town west of Canton, a place where men worked with their hands, and the promise of the American century felt close enough to touch, but still just out of reach. Inside the store, after the lights went out and the customers went home, a janitor named James Murray Spangler was fighting a losing battle against his own lungs. Spangler was 59 years old. He had spent his life chasing the American dream through a dozen different doors, inventing gadgets, filing patents, watching each one fail to catch fire. Now he swept floors for a living, pushing a broom across the carpets of a department store. And every stroke of the bristles sent a cloud of dust into the air that made his asthma scream. His chest tightened, his throat burned. The act of cleaning was slowly killing him. So he did what desperate men with restless minds do. He went home to his basement and built a solution out of junk. He took a wooden soap box, the kind that held laundry detergent. He mounted a small electric fan motor on top of it, the kind used to cool overheated factory workers. He attached a broom handle as a vertical support. He took one of his wife's satin pillowcases and rigged it as a dust bag. The contraption looked like it had been assembled by a child playing inventor. It was crude. It was ugly. It was held together with hope and friction. But when he plugged it in and pushed it across the floor, the fan motor created suction. The dust was pulled up off the carpet and trapped in the pillowcase. For the first time in months, Spangler could breathe. He knew immediately that he had something. This was not just a device for an asthmatic janitor. This was a machine that could change the way America cleaned its homes. He filed for a patent in 1907 and received patent number 935-558 on June 2nd, 1908. He called it the electric suction sweeper. It was the first portable electric vacuum cleaner that actually worked. But Spangler had no money. He had no factory. He had no way to turn his basement prototype into a product that could reach the nation. So he turned to family. His cousin was married to a man named William Henry Hoover. Hoover was not a vacuum man. He was a leather man. He had built a successful business in New Berlin, making saddles, horse collars, and harnesses for the transportation industry. But Hoover was also a man who could see around corners. He understood that the automobile was coming and that the horse was dying. His leather business was a sunset industry. He needed something new. Spangler demonstrated his machine to Hoover, and Hoover did not see a soapbox with a fan. He saw the future of the American home. In 1908, Hoover bought Spangler's patent. He kept Spangler on as a production supervisor and began manufacturing the electric suction sweeper in a corner of his leather factory. He hired 6 employees. They worked with metal and wood and fabric, assembling the machines by hand. The company was called the Electric Suction Sweeper Company, and it was built on a simple premise. Give the American housewife a tool that could suck the dirt out of her carpets without breaking her back. The first model they sold was called the Model O. It was a monster. It weighed 40 pounds. Half of that weight was the Westinghouse motor bolted to the frame. It still had a broom handle sticking out of it like a flagpole. It looked like something you would use to start a lawnmower, not clean a living room. But it worked. And in 1909, the company sold over 2,000 units at $60 each. That was a fortune in 1909. It was the equivalent of nearly $2,000 in today's money. The people who bought them were not the masses. They were the early adopters, the wealthy, the people who had electricity in their homes when most of America was still lighting candles. But Hoover understood something that Spangler did not. He understood that a product was nothing without a system to sell it. He was a businessman, not just an inventor. In December of 1908, Hoover took out a full-page advertisement in the Saturday Evening Post. The ad was bold and direct. It offered a free 10-day trial of the vacuum cleaner in your home. No money down, no obligation. Just try it and see if it works. This was revolutionary. Most companies in 1908 expected you to walk into a store and buy their product sight unseen. Hoover was saying, bring it into your home, use it on your floors, and if you don't want it, send it back. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured into the New Berlin factory. Orders came from across the country. Hoover quickly realized that he had tapped into something primal in the American psyche. The housewife wanted control over her environment. She wanted cleanliness, and she was willing to pay for a machine that could deliver it. Within a year, Hoover had expanded the factory. He stopped making horse collars. The leather business was dead. The vacuum business was alive. In 1915, James Murray Spangler died. He never lived to see his invention conquer the world. But his name was already fading from the story. The company had been renamed the Hoover Suction Sweeper Company. The machines were called Hoovers. In England, where the company began exporting in 1919, the word Hoover became a verb. To hoover meant to vacuum. The brand had become the category. This was the ultimate victory in American commerce. You had not just sold a product, you had colonized the language. By 1922, the company was renamed the Hoover Company, and leadership had passed to William Hoover's son, Herbert William. Hoover Sr. Herbert was cut from a different cloth than his father. The father had been a leather merchant who stumbled into the vacuum business. The son was a visionary who understood that the vacuum was just the beginning. He wanted to build an empire. He wanted to make Hoover synonymous with the modern American home. In 1926, Hoover introduced the beater bar, a rotating brush that did not just suck the dirt out of the carpet, but beat it out. The slogan was brilliant. It beats as it sweeps, as it cleans. 3 verbs, 3 promises. It was poetry written in the language of machinery. The beater bar became the standard that every vacuum cleaner in the world would chase. Hoover was not just selling appliances. It was setting the rules of the game. By the 1930s, the factory in North Canton, Ohio, which had absorbed the old New Berlin works, was a thundering cathedral of American industry. At its peak, the factory employed over 4,000 workers. The complex sprawled across acres of industrial land, a fortress of brick and steel that dominated the skyline of the small town. The floors shook with the rhythm of stamping presses. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal and machine oil. This was not a toy factory. This was a place where serious men built serious machines. Walk onto that factory floor in 1940 and you would witness industrial ballet. Sheets of steel fed into massive presses that punched out vacuum housings with the force of a pile driver. The noise was deafening. Workers wore cotton in their ears. Sparks flew from grinding wheels as sharp edges were smoothed. The assembly line moved with mechanical precision. A worker would attach the motor housing. The next would install the motor itself, a heavy electric beast that weighed 10 pounds alone. Another would thread the electrical cord. Another would attach the wheels. Another would test the suction. Every machine was run for 10 minutes before it left the factory. If it failed, it went back to the line to be fixed. The vacuums that came off the line were heavy, durable, built to last a generation. They were made of steel and cast aluminum. They had motors that could run for 20 years without breaking. The housings were painted with industrial-grade enamel. the same kind used on automobiles. The wheels were made of solid rubber that would not crack or split. The brushes in the beater bar were made of natural bristles that could survive thousands of hours of use. Hoover believed that a vacuum cleaner was an investment, a tool that should outlive the house it cleaned. The company culture reflected this philosophy. Workers who spent 30 years on the assembly line took immense pride in the machines they built. They knew that the vacuum cleaner they assembled on a Tuesday morning in North Canton might still be running in a house in California in 1970. This was not planned obsolescence. This was planned immortality. The company offered warranties that seemed insane by modern standards. If something broke, Hoover would fix it. If a part wore out, Hoover would replace it. The company maintained vast warehouses of spare parts going back decades. You could walk into a Hoover service center in 1960 with a vacuum from 1930, and they would have the parts to repair it. The company expanded globally. In 1911, they built a factory in Windsor, Canada. In 1919, they began selling vacuums in Britain. By 1932, they had established Hoover Limited in the United Kingdom. In 1938, they opened a massive factory in Perival, just outside London. The British factory became a symbol of industrial pride. It employed thousands of workers. It produced sleek, modern machines designed by industrial artists who understood that a vacuum cleaner was not just a tool, but a piece of furniture, an object that had to sit in the corner of a living room and not offend the eye. During World War II, the Hoover factories were retooled for war production. The North Canton plant stopped making vacuum cleaners and started making parachutes for cluster bombs, small motors for gun turrets, inflatable life-preserving belts, helmet liners, and fuses. The company that had built its fortune on cleanliness was now building instruments of destruction. But this was the bargain of American industry. You made what the country needed, and when the war was over, you went back to making what the country wanted. And what the country wanted after 1945 was normalcy. The soldiers came home. They married their sweethearts. They moved into suburban houses with lawns and driveways and living rooms with wall-to-wall carpeting. And every one of those living rooms needed a vacuum cleaner. The Hoover Company was perfectly positioned to capture this wave. The brand was trusted. The machines were proven. By the 1950s, Hoover controlled a massive share of the vacuum cleaner market in both America and Britain. But the seeds of destruction were already being planted. Herbert Hoover Sr. had died in 1954. His son, Herbert Hoover Jr., took over as president. The third generation, and this is where the story begins to fracture. Because Herbert Jr. was not his grandfather. He was not even his father. He was a man born into an empire, and he carried the burden of legacy without the hunger that had built it. By the 1960s, the market was changing. Competitors were rising. Brands like Electrolux were building their own sales forces, undercutting Hoover's dominance. The company's profit margins were shrinking. By the time Herbert Jr. took control, profits represented only 3% of sales. The empire that had once printed money was now barely breaking even. In 1966, a proxy battle erupted. The board forced Herbert Hoover Jr. out. The family that had built the company lost control of it. A man named Felix Mansager, who had started as a door-to-door vacuum salesman in 1929, became the new chief executive. The Hoover family was gone. The company that bore their name was now in the hands of professional managers who had no emotional attachment to the legacy. They saw a brand. They saw assets. They did not see a cathedral. In 1989, the Maytag Corporation acquired the Hoover Company as part of a larger deal to purchase Chicago Pacific Corporation. Maytag paid $961 million. The primary reason for the acquisition was to gain access to Hoover's European operations. Maytag wanted a foothold in the United Kingdom and continental Europe before the unification of the European Economic Community in 1992. They believed that Hoover's brand recognition in Britain would give them an advantage. But the acquisition was a disaster from the start. Maytag took on $500 million to buy Chicago Pacific. The company was over-leveraged, and Hoover Europe, the crown jewel of the deal, was hemorrhaging money. Year after year, the European operations bled red ink. The recession of the early 1990s hit hard. Competition from new brands like Dyson was eating into Hoover's market share. By 1992, Hoover's profits in Britain had fallen from $147 million in 1987 to $74 million. The warehouses were full of unsold inventory. The company was desperate, and desperation makes men do stupid things. In late 1992, the British division of Hoover was approached by a small, struggling travel agency. The agency had an idea: offer free flights to customers who bought Hoover products. It would move inventory and boost sales. Hoover liked the sound of it. They launched a promotion in August of 1992. Buy any Hoover product worth at least £100 and receive 2 free round-trip tickets to destinations in Europe. The flights were worth approximately £600. The math was insane. You were giving away something worth 6 times more than the product being sold. But Hoover believed that most customers would not actually redeem the tickets. The terms of the promotion were deliberately complex. You had to mail in your receipt within 14 days. Then Hoover would send you a registration form. You had to return that within 14 days. Then they would send you a travel voucher. You had 30 days to choose 3 combinations of departure airports, dates, and destinations. Hoover reserved the right to refuse all 3 and demand 3 more alternatives. The company assumed that most people would get frustrated and give up. They were wrong. The promotion was a sensation. Sales exploded. Customers bought the cheapest Hoover product they could find, a vacuum cleaner priced at £119.99, just to get the free flights. Factories had to run 7 days a week to keep up with demand. The warehouses began to empty. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like Hoover had pulled off a miracle. Then in November of 1992, the company made the decision that would kill it. They expanded the promotion to include flights to the United States. Buy a Hoover product for £100 and get 2 free round-trip tickets to New York or Orlando. The tickets were now worth even more. The public went insane. People were buying vacuum cleaners they did not want or need just to get the flights. Some customers did not even bother to pick up their purchases. They left the vacuums in the store and walked out with the receipt. Over 300,000 people bought qualifying products. That meant Hoover was on the hook for 600,000 free flights. The company had projected 50,000 applicants. They were off by a factor of 6. The cost of honoring the promotion was approximately £50 million. The gross revenue from the sales during the promotion was only £30 million. Hoover had lost £20 million in a matter of months. But the financial loss was only the beginning. The real damage was to the brand. Hoover began trying to wriggle out of the promotion. They made the redemption process even more difficult. They lost paperwork. They delayed sending out tickets. Customers who had jumped through every hoop found themselves waiting months with no response. The British press turned on Hoover. The company that had once been synonymous with reliability was now a symbol of corporate dishonesty. thousands of customers joined a group called the Hoover Pressure Group to lobby against the company. Lawsuits were filed. Politicians got involved. The scandal became front-page news. The president of Hoover Europe and 2 marketing executives were fired. Maytag, the parent company in the United States, had to cover the shortfall. They spent an additional £7 million on an advertising campaign to try to restore Hoover's reputation. It did not work. Hundreds of thousands of customers never received their tickets. The company's market share in Britain collapsed from over 50% to under 10%. It never recovered. In May of 1995, Maytag sold Hoover Europe to Candy, an Italian appliance manufacturer, for approximately £100 million. The company that had dominated the British vacuum market for nearly 40 years was sold at a loss to a competitor. The free flights promotion had destroyed Hoover's European empire. But the story does not end there, because the American side of the business was still alive, and it was about to be gutted. In 2005, Whirlpool Corporation acquired Maytag for approximately $1.68 billion. Whirlpool wanted Maytag's brands. It wanted the Maytag name, the Gen Air stoves, the Amana appliances, and it got Hoover as part of the package. But Whirlpool did not want Hoover. It already had its own vacuum division. Hoover was redundant. In 2007, Whirlpool sold the Hoover brand in North America to Tektronix Industries, a Hong Kong-based company that specialized in power tools and floor care products. The sale included the manufacturing facilities. And on a cold day in September of 2007, Tektronix Industries announced that it was closing the historic Hoover factory in North Canton, Ohio. The factory that had employed over 4,000 workers at its peak was shut down. Approximately 750 to 800 jobs were lost. The machines were turned off. The stamping presses went silent. The building that had been the beating heart of the company for nearly a century was emptied out. Some of the workers were offered jobs at Tektronix headquarters in Glen Willow, Ohio. Most were not. They were given severance checks and told to find new work in a town that had just lost its primary employer. The closure of the North Canton factory was not just an economic event. It was a funeral. The town of North Canton had been built around Hoover. The company had provided jobs, funded the YMCA, built the library, supported the schools. The Hoover family had been pillars of the community. William Hoover, the founder, had served as the first mayor of New Berlin before the town changed its name to North Canton during World War I to escape anti-German sentiment. His son Herbert had brought 84 British children to North Canton during World War II to keep them safe from the Blitz. The family had poured millions into the community through charitable foundations. But none of that mattered when the spreadsheet said the factory was no longer profitable. The building sat empty for years, a hulking corpse on Main Street. Eventually, parts of it were repurposed. One section became a campus for Stark State College. Another section was converted into a megachurch. The corporate offices were leased out to smaller businesses. The town tried to rebrand the area as the Hoover District, a mixed-use development with retail, restaurants, and loft-style living. It was an attempt to paper over the loss with nostalgia and manufactured charm. But the soul was gone. The factory that had once roared with the sound of American industry was silent. The smell of hot metal and machine oil had been replaced by the sterile scent of air conditioning and fresh paint. The workers who had spent their lives perfecting the art of the vacuum cleaner were gone, scattered to other towns, other industries, other lives. The Hoover brand still exists today. You can still buy a Hoover vacuum cleaner. In North America, the brand is owned by Tektronic Industries. In Europe, it is owned by Haier, a Chinese company that bought it from Candy. The machines are made in China. They are lighter, cheaper, designed to be replaced every few years rather than passed down through generations. The heavy steel housings are gone, replaced by plastic. The motors are smaller, quieter, less durable. The beater bar is still there, but it is a ghost of what it once was. The tragedy of the Hoover story is not that the company failed. It is that the company succeeded so completely that it forgot what made it great. In the beginning, Hoover was built by a desperate janitor who could not breathe and a leather merchant who could see the future. It was built on the belief that a vacuum cleaner should be a machine, not a toy. It should be heavy. It should be durable. It should last a lifetime. The early Hoovers were sold with a promise. This is a tool that will serve you faithfully for decades. But by the 1990s, that promise had been abandoned. The company was being run by men who cared more about quarterly earnings than long-term reputation. They made decisions that traded the future for the present. The Aanveld free flights promotion was the most spectacular example of this philosophy. But it was not the only one. Year after year, the company chased short-term gains at the expense of the brand. They cut costs. They cheapened the materials. They outsourced production. They treated the Hoover name as an asset to be strip-mined rather than a legacy to be protected. And the customers noticed. The Hoover of 1950 was a machine that could survive being dropped down a flight of stairs. The Hoover of 2000 was a plastic shell that cracked if you bumped it into a table leg. The trust was broken. The relationship between the company and the customer, which had been built over 50 years of reliability, was destroyed in a single decade of cost-cutting and incompetence. The closure of the North Canton factory was not a sudden death. It was the final breath of a body that had been dying for years. The factory had been kept alive by inertia, by the memory of what it once was. But once Whirlpool sold the brand to Tektronic, there was no reason to keep the American factory open. The manufacturing could be done cheaper in China. The workers could be replaced by automation. The history could be erased. Today, if you visit North Canton, you can see the Hoover Historical Center, a Victorian farmhouse built in 1853 that was the boyhood home of William Hoover. It sits on the original Hoover family farmland, donated to Walsh University. Inside, there are exhibits about the history of the company. You can see the early vacuum cleaners, the Model O with its broom handle and soapbox ancestry. You can see advertisements from the 1920s, sleek Art Deco designs that promised modernity and efficiency. You can see photographs of the factory floor in its glory days, rows of workers assembling machines with their hands, the air thick with purpose. But you cannot see the factory itself. It is gone. The building has been repurposed, divided, sold off in pieces. The machines have been scrapped. The workers have retired or moved on. The smell of hot metal and machine oil exists only in the memories of the men and women who spent their lives on that floor. And those memories are fading. The Hoover Company was born from desperation. A janitor who could not breathe built a machine to save his lungs, and a leather merchant who could see the future turned that machine into an empire. For 50 years, Hoover was the standard by which all other vacuum cleaners were judged. The brand was so dominant that it became the language itself. To Hoover was to clean. To own a Hoover was to own a piece of the American dream. But empires built on innovation can be destroyed by complacency. And the Hoover Company became complacent. It stopped innovating. It stopped respecting its customers. It stopped believing in the philosophy that had made it great. The machines became lighter, cheaper, more disposable. The promise of durability was replaced by the promise of convenience. And when a company abandons its core values, it loses the right to exist. The free flights promotion of 1992 was not the cause of Hoover's downfall. It was a symptom. It was the final, desperate act of a company that had already lost its way. A company that believed it could trick its customers into buying products they did not want with a gimmick that made no financial sense. A company that had forgotten that trust, once broken, cannot be repaired with advertising campaigns and public relations spin. The lesson of Hoover is simple. You cannot build a legacy on shortcuts. You cannot maintain trust by cutting costs. You cannot preserve a brand by treating it as a commodity. The American consumer is smarter than the boardroom thinks. They can feel the difference between a machine built to last and a product designed to be replaced. They can tell when a company respects them and when it is trying to exploit them. James Murray Spangler died in 1915, long before Hoover became a household name. But he would have recognized the trajectory of the company. He had spent his life chasing inventions that failed because they did not solve a real problem or because he did not have the resources to bring them to market. The vacuum cleaner was different. It solved a real problem. It made life better. And when William Hoover took that invention and turned it into a company, he did so with the belief that quality mattered. That belief carried the company for 50 years. And when that belief was abandoned, the company died. Not overnight, not with a bang, but slowly, quietly, in a series of boardroom decisions that traded the soul of the brand for a few points of quarterly profit. The factory in North Canton is silent now. The workers are gone. The machines are scrap. But the ghost of what Hoover once was still lingers in the air. It lingers in the memories of the people who worked on that factory floor, who took pride in building machines that would outlast them. It lingers in the attics and basements of America, where old Hoover vacuum cleaners from the 1950s and 60s still sit, still functional, still ready to clean. Monuments to an era when a company believed that a product should be built to last. The empire is dead. The name survives, slapped onto cheap plastic machines made in Chinese factories by workers who have never heard of North Canton, Ohio. But the spirit is gone. The belief that a vacuum cleaner should be a machine, not a toy, has been replaced by the belief that everything is disposable. Everything is temporary. Everything can be replaced. The story of Hoover is the story of American industry in miniature. It is the story of innovation and ambition, of building something from nothing, of creating a product so good that it becomes the language itself. But it is also the story of greed and short-sightedness, of executives who cared more about their bonuses than the legacy they inherited of a company that forgot why it existed in the first place. The janitor who could not breathe is gone. The leather merchant who saw the future is gone. The factory that employed 4,000 workers is gone. The machines that lasted a lifetime are gone. All that remains is a name on a box, a ghost of an empire that once believed in quality, in durability, in the promise that a well-built machine could change the world. And in the end, that is the darkest part of the story. Not that Hoover failed, but that it succeeded so brilliantly for so long, only to be destroyed by the very people who were supposed to protect it.